That night, I was the last to leave the office, something that rarely happened. I work in a commercial building in the city center, where the routine is always the same: arrive early, face piles of reports, and leave at the end of the day. But that night, there was a tight deadline, and I chose to stay late to finish everything. The office lights were already off, and silence dominated the floor when I finally shut down my computer. I walked through the empty hallway toward the elevator, hearing the echo of my footsteps on the marble floor. It was strange how the building seemed so different at night. During the day, it was full of life, but after hours, the silence and darkness gave the place an almost oppressive atmosphere. When I reached the elevator, I pressed the button to go down, waiting patiently while watching the indicator lights of the floors. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped in and pressed the ground floor button. The doors closed with a slight creak, and the elevator began to descend slowly. I was tired, with my mind focused on getting home, taking a hot shower, and resting. But shortly after starting to descend, the elevator shook slightly, and the lights flickered briefly. My heart raced. I've always been a bit claustrophobic, so the thought of being stuck in an elevator terrified me. However, the elevator continued to descend, though more slowly than usual. I felt relieved, but something still didn't seem right. The lights kept flickering, and the control panel showed that the elevator was passing through the floors more slowly than normal. When the elevator passed the 10th floor, I realized it was going beyond where it should have stopped. I pressed the ground floor button several times, but it didn't respond. Panic began to set in, and I started pressing other buttons, trying to make the elevator stop. Nothing worked. The elevator continued its descent, now faster, but the panel lights were showing numbers that made no sense. It was descending to floors that didn't exist in the building. Something was very, very wrong. As the elevator continued its descent, I realized it was going to floors that didn't exist in the building. The panel showed numbers like -1, -2, -3, and I knew that wasn't possible. The building where I worked had a basement, but nothing beyond that. I felt a chill down my spine and tried to convince myself it was just a system malfunction. Even so, fear began to take hold of me. I pressed all the buttons again, but the elevator didn't respond. I tried to use the emergency phone installed on the wall, but there was no signal. The only thing I could do was wait and hope the elevator would stop. The sound of the motor working incessantly and the vibrations in the metal walls made everything seem even more surreal. Suddenly, the elevator stopped with a jolt, and the doors slowly opened. The number on the panel showed -5, a floor that shouldn't exist. I looked outside, expecting to see a dark basement or a maintenance room. But what I saw was a dimly lit hallway, with walls covered in soot and a strong smell of mold in the air. Something about that place felt wrong, as if it hadn't been used in decades. I hesitated, but a morbid curiosity led me to step out. The silence was oppressive. There was a suffocating heat that made the air feel heavy. I started walking down the corridor, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. The elevator light flickered behind me, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The further I walked, the more my discomfort grew. The place seemed abandoned, yet it had a disturbing feeling that I wasn't alone. At the end of the corridor, I saw a partially open iron door. A faint light emanated from inside. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know whether to continue or return to the elevator. But before I could make a decision, I heard a sound coming from the door, a low sound, almost like a whisper. Curiosity, mixed with terror, made me move forward. Slowly, I pushed the door, expecting to see an empty room, but what I found made me recoil in horror. The iron door creaked as I pushed it, revealing a dark and damp room. The faint light that emanated from within came from an old fluorescent lamp, hanging from the ceiling by exposed wires. The scene that unfolded before me was pure terror. In the center of the room, there was a metal table covered with rust marks and stains that I preferred not to identify. Around the table, shelves full of old rusty instruments, all covered in dust, as if no one had touched them in years. The air was heavy, and the smell of mold was even stronger inside. But what really made me tremble with fear were the objects laid out on the table. There were notebooks with yellowed and torn pages, filled with handwritten notes in a disorderly script. The drawings on the pages were disturbing, depicting strange diagrams, symbols I had never seen before, and sketches of human figures in positions that suggested something terrible. Among the notebooks, I saw something that looked like a straw doll, but the details of the face were so realistic that I felt nauseous. I felt I needed to get out of there immediately, but my feet seemed glued to the floor. The whisper I had heard earlier became louder, coming from somewhere inside the room, but I couldn't pinpoint where. It was an incomprehensible sound, a mix of words and moans, that seemed to penetrate my mind. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, and the only thing I could think of was escaping. Suddenly, one of the shelves in the corner of the room fell, scattering objects on the floor with a deafening crash. It was enough to snap me out of my trance of terror. I turned and ran back down the corridor without looking back. My only thought was to reach the elevator and get out of that cursed place. When I got to the elevator, the doors were still open, as if waiting for me. I rushed in and pressed the ground floor button repeatedly. The doors closed with a metallic creak, and the elevator began to ascend. My heart was pounding so fast it felt like it would burst out of my chest. With each floor that passed, I felt a growing sense of relief, but I was still terrified of what I had seen. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, I ran out of the building without looking back. I never knew exactly what that underground floor was or how the elevator took me there. I reported the incident to the building's maintenance manager, but they claimed there were no records of any basement beyond the first one, used only for storage. Since then, I've avoided using that elevator, and the memories of that night still haunt me. Something in that building is much darker than it appears, and I had the misfortune to discover it. That night, I was in the middle of a long-distance delivery, something that had become part of my routine as a truck driver for years. My name is Jake, and I'm used to spending nights driving along deserted roads, with only the radio and the truck's headlights for company. It was a normal trip until I decided to take a detour to avoid a major traffic jam on the main highway. The secondary road seemed quiet, and at first, it was a relief to get out of the heavy traffic. The GPS indicated that the road would take me back to the highway a few miles ahead, so I continued without thinking twice. But as the minutes passed, I began to notice that something was strange. The road seemed endless, and there was no sign of life around. No houses, no gas stations, no other vehicles. The discomfort began to set in when the GPS started giving confusing signals, losing the signal and showing my location as if I were in the middle of nowhere. The road, once well paved, now began to look older, with potholes and cracks that made the truck bounce with every mile traveled. I looked at the sky, hoping to see some landmark that would indicate I was on the right path, but all I saw were heavy clouds, covering the moon and stars. I decided to keep going, believing I would soon find an exit, but the feeling of déjà vu began to bother me. I passed an old traffic sign that I could barely read because of the rust. A few miles later, I passed the same sign again. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, I saw the same curve in the road, the same crooked tree by the roadside. I was trapped in a loop. Panic began to grow inside me. I started questioning my sanity. I turned on the radio, but all I could hear was static. I looked in the rearview mirror, hoping to see the lights of another vehicle, but the darkness behind me was complete. What was supposed to be a simple detour had turned into a nightmare. I was trapped on a road that seemed to have no end, and every turn I made took me back to the same point, but with the road becoming increasingly sinister. As I continued driving down the road, the feeling of déjà vu intensified. With each curve, each mile, I recognized the same landmarks: the crooked tree, the old rusty traffic sign, even a peculiar rock by the roadside. It was as if I was driving in circles, but there was no intersection or detour to get out of that loop. The anguish began to take over me, and I realized I was trapped in an endless cycle. I tried several times to return to the point where I had started, hoping to find the way back to the main highway, but each attempt led me back to the same road. With each new turn, the road seemed to change subtly, as if it were deteriorating over time. The cracks in the asphalt grew deeper, and the vegetation along the roadside seemed denser and darker. Something on this road was terribly wrong, but I couldn't understand what it was. The night wore on, and fear mixed with exhaustion. The truck's engine roared, but the sound seemed muffled, as if the road was sucking all the energy around. The GPS was completely useless, showing only a blank screen with no signal. I tried using my phone, but there was no service, and the voice messages I recorded to explain the situation were never sent. I was isolated, alone on a road that seemed to exist outside of time and space. With each new turn, the darkness around me seemed to intensify. I began to see shadowy figures on the side of the road, like motionless silhouettes that disappeared when I tried to focus on them. They were quick and disturbing visions that left me increasingly terrified. My nerves were on edge, and my mind started playing tricks on me, making me question what was real and what was the result of fatigue and fear. On one of the turns, I saw something that froze my blood. In the middle of the road, there was a wrecked car, partially covered by vegetation. I stopped the truck and got out to investigate. The car had been there for a long time, but what scared me was the fact that the car seemed identical to my own truck, as if it were a version of it that had been left to rot. The sight filled me with an indescribable terror. I ran back to the truck and sped off, desperately trying to find an exit, but the road seemed to be closing in around me. I floored the accelerator, trying to escape the terrifying vision of the wrecked car that looked like an abandoned version of my own vehicle. Fear and adrenaline drove me, but the road seemed increasingly strange, as if it were unfolding before me in an endless distortion. The asphalt was almost unrecognizable, covered in deep cracks and invaded by roots that emerged from the ground like claws trying to trap me there. The shadowy figures on the side of the road became more visible, and now I could see that they were human, or at least, they had been human. Their silhouettes were distorted, their eyes glowing in the darkness, and they seemed to be watching my struggle to escape. I didn't dare look at them for too long, but their presence was undeniable. Every time I passed one of those figures, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if a part of me was being sucked into the road. The time loop seemed endless, but I knew I couldn't go on like this forever. My fuel was running out, and the thought of being trapped on that road with no power terrified me. In a last desperate attempt, I decided to do something I had never tried before. I accelerated towards the first figure I saw on the road. My idea was to interrupt the cycle, break the loop somehow, even if it meant a direct confrontation with the unknown. The truck surged forward, and I felt the impact as I hit the figure, but instead of a physical collision, it was like passing through an invisible barrier. Suddenly, the environment around me changed. The road dissolved into total darkness, and for a few seconds, all I could hear was the sound of my own heart beating uncontrollably. When the light returned, I was back on the main highway. The asphalt was smooth, the sky clear, and the familiarity of the known road was an immense relief. But the relief was brief. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my heart stop. The shadowy figures were closer, now visible, and one of them was in the back seat of the truck, watching me with those glowing eyes. I screamed and floored the accelerator, trying to get as far away as possible. But deep down, I knew that something had changed in me, and that encounter on the road wouldn't stay there. Since then, I haven't been able to shake the feeling of being watched, even in broad daylight. The shadowy figures appear in my peripheral vision, and the sound of the road is always present in my nightmares. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I'm sure something followed me out of that time loop. And every time I get into my truck for a new trip, I feel that eventually, that road will find me again. I've always been passionate about photography, and nothing relaxes me more than spending a few days alone, capturing the beauty of nature. My name is Sarah, and last fall, I decided to isolate myself in a remote cabin in a forest in the countryside to disconnect from the world and focus on my hobby. The idea of being completely surrounded by trees and the silence of the forest was exactly what I needed after months of work stress. The trip to the cabin was peaceful. The winding road through the forest was stunning, with the falling leaves covering the ground like a golden carpet. The cabin itself was simple but cozy, equipped with everything I would need for a relaxing weekend. I unloaded my photography equipment and took a look around, enchanted by the beauty and tranquility of the place. I spent the afternoon exploring the surroundings of the cabin, taking photos of the tall trees, the nearby stream, and the local wildlife. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky with orange hues, when I returned to the cabin. I prepared a quick meal, lit the fireplace, and snuggled up with a book. The peace and isolation were exactly what I needed, and the tranquil atmosphere made me completely relax. But as night fell, the feeling of tranquility began to transform into something more unsettling. The silence of the forest, which once seemed serene, now felt oppressive. It was as if the nocturnal sounds of the forest were being muffled by some invisible presence. Around 10 at night, as I was about to go to bed, I heard something that made my heart race, a low, distant singing coming from the forest. The sound was strange, hypnotic, almost like a melody sung by several voices. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or some nocturnal animal. But the sound continued, soft and persistent, as if it were calling to me. I decided not to give it much importance and forced myself to sleep, but the forest's song was now etched in my mind, and a sense that something was wrong settled in me. I woke up in the middle of the night with my heart pounding. The sound was back, but this time it was clearer and closer. The hypnotic melody was coming from deep within the forest, blending with the darkness of the surroundings. I sat up in bed, trying to understand what was happening. It was as if several voices were singing in harmony, but the words were incomprehensible, almost like an ancient whisper. My first instinct was to grab my camera and record the sound. As a photographer, I've always been fascinated by unique and mysterious moments in nature, and this was certainly one of them. I grabbed my flashlight, put on a coat, and left the cabin, trying to locate the source of the singing. The air was cold, and the darkness around was almost palpable. Only the flashlight's beam cut through the dense darkness. I walked a few meters into the forest, following the sound. With each step, the singing grew more intense, as if it were guiding me. What should have been a simple nighttime walk in the forest began to turn into a surreal experience. The trees around me seemed to close in, creating a dark and narrow tunnel. The feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. Suddenly, the flashlight began to flicker intermittently. Fear started to take hold of me. I was alone, in the middle of an unfamiliar forest, being guided by a sound that seemed to come from some deep and dangerous place. The singing, which initially seemed merely strange, now had a sinister quality. The voices no longer sounded harmonious. There was a tone of lament, almost like a call from something lost. Finally, the sound led me to a clearing. The flashlight stopped working completely, leaving me at the mercy of the darkness. In the center of the clearing, in the faint moonlight filtering through the treetops, I saw what appeared to be an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and plants. The singing was at its peak, but I still couldn't see where it was coming from. It was as if the voices were all around me, echoing in my mind, and I realized I had gone too far. Terror overwhelmed me, and without thinking twice, I started running back to the cabin, with the sound still chasing me. Panic took over as I ran through the forest, trying to find my way back to the cabin. The singing still echoed around me, but now it seemed to be everywhere, reverberating between the trees and invading my mind. Every shadow seemed to move, and the darkness felt thicker than before, as if the forest was trying to swallow me. I spotted the cabin in the distance. When I reached the door, I hurried inside and locked it behind me, panting and with my heart racing. I tried to calm my breathing, but the singing continued, though now muffled by the cabin's walls. Something in those voices had a disturbing effect, as if they were trying to pull me back into the forest. I knew I couldn't spend the rest of the night there, being haunted by that sound. I decided I needed to understand what was happening, so I headed to the kitchen table and grabbed my laptop, searching for any information that could explain what I was hearing. I researched the forest, the surrounding area, and any legends or stories that might be related to the singing. That's when I found something that sent chills down my spine. I discovered that many years ago, the forest was considered a sacred place by an ancient tribe that lived in the region. They believed that the forest was inhabited by spirits who could lure people into their realm through hypnotic singing, leading them to a place from which they would never return. It was said that, from time to time, the singing would return, seeking new souls to join the lost spirits in the forest. The fear intensified when I realized that the descriptions matched exactly what I was experiencing. It wasn't just a legend. Something in the forest was trying to lure me, and I had been foolish enough to follow it. I knew I needed to get out of there before it was too late. I hurriedly packed my things, putting everything back in the car, while the singing continued, insistent and hypnotic, like a temptation I needed to resist. When I finally got into the car and started driving away from the cabin, the sound began to fade, as if it were moving away. But I knew it would never really leave me. Even when I returned to the city, the echoes of that singing remained in my mind, haunting me in nightmares and moments of silence. The forest had shown its darkest side, and I knew I would never return to that place. What really happened that night is something I may never fully understand, but one thing is certain: some parts of nature hold secrets that are best left untouched.